By the mid-3rd century, the Roman state was physically breaking apart. Military anarchy had bankrupted the treasury, and while the frontiers were being breached, the central government in Rome had largely lost control of its own provinces. Emperor Gallienus oversaw this collapse with a noted lack of urgency. As long as he could maintain his personal pleasures in Italy, the loss of a province or the defeat of a Roman army rarely seemed to disturb his schedule. The crisis finally reached Italy's doorstep. To the north, a rebel general named Aureolus crossed the Alps and occupied Milan, directly challenging the emperor. To the east, a massive Gothic fleet moved through the Bosphorus, preparing to strike the wealthy cities of the Mediterranean. The empire was now caught in a systemic squeeze. A superpower led by an elite that prioritized palace luxury over border security had run out of time to react. Gallienus finally left Rome to besiege the rebels in Milan, but his commanders had reached a breaking point. While the siege engines battered the city walls, the senior officers were secretly planning the emperor's death. Late at night, the conspirators raised a false alarm that the rebels were making a desperate sally from the city. Gallienus rushed out to lead the defense, without armor or guards, and amidst the nocturnal tumult, he was struck down by a mortal dart. The assassination left the empire without a head. The treasury remained empty, the soldiers neared mutiny, and the Gothic horde advanced inward. The new administration at Milan did not just inherit a throne. They inherited a catastrophe that the old methods of governing were no longer capable of solving. The conspirators turned to Claudius, a native of the Martial provinces along the Danube. Unlike the previous emperors, Claudius was a career soldier who had spent his youth in the camps rather than the palace. He immediately addressed the breakdown in discipline. When the troops expressed resentment over the change in leadership, he confronted them directly, arguing that their own lawless behavior had ruined the provinces that were supposed to feed and support them. After securing their obedience, he gave the army a new focus. He informed them that internal politics would have to wait. They were marching north to engage a Gothic force reported to be 320,000 strong. By forcing the legions to choose between their own survival and their historical habit of rebellion, Claudius managed to point the full weight of the Roman military at the invaders. The two forces met near Naissus. The Romans were heavily outnumbered by the various nations fighting under the Gothic standard, who had brought their families and entire wagon trains for a permanent settlement. During the heat of the battle, Claudius's preparation changed the outcome. A Roman detachment he had hidden in the mountain passes suddenly emerged, hitting the Gothic rear in a massive ambush that reportedly left 50,000 invaders dead. Claudius used his knowledge of the country to maintain the pressure. Over the following months, the Romans systematically cut off the Gothic retreat paths across Macedonia and Thrace, preventing the fragmented host from regrouping. He eventually drove the survivors into the most inaccessible parts of Mount Haemus. Trapped by Roman posts and a rigorous winter, the trapped multitude was slowly diminished by famine and disease. By utilizing terrain and rigid command, Claudius didn't just win a battle. He engineered the total collapse of the largest invasion force the empire had ever faced. The victory was short-lived. The same plague that devastated the Goths spread to the Roman camp, and after a reign of only 2 years, Claudius died at Sirmium. His brother, Quintilius, attempted to take the throne, but he lasted only 17 days. The army on the Danube had already decided they would only follow a commander who possessed the same merit as Claudius. They chose Aurelian. Like his predecessor, he was a Danubian soldier, the son of a peasant farmer who had risen through the ranks to become the commander of the cavalry. The old system of aristocratic succession had been replaced by a rigid meritocracy born of the frontier. The troops no longer cared for lineage, they cared for results. Aurelian enforced an extreme code of conduct. Soldiers were forbidden from gambling, drinking, or stealing even a bunch of grapes from the provincials. Their wealth, he declared, was to be taken from the enemy's spoils, not from the tears of Roman subjects. Punishment was absolute. When a soldier seduced the wife of a host, Aurelian had him tied to 2 bent trees, which, when released, tore the man in 2. This set a standard that the seditious legions were now too terrified to challenge. In less than 5 years, Aurelian used this revitalized military force to march from one end of the empire to the other,
destroying separatist regimes in both the East and the West, and reuniting the Roman world. Rome was not saved by the elites in the capital. It was saved by the pragmatists from the margins, who realized that in a state of total collapse, survival is only possible through uncompromising, iron discipline.
Following the death of Emperor Claudius, the Roman world began to fracture. The military was stretched to the point of exhaustion, and internal rebellions threatened to trigger a total collapse of the state. The empire's central forces were depleted after 20 years of constant warfare against Gothic tribes along the northern borders. In the west, the wealthy provinces of Gaul, Spain, and Britain broke away to form a rogue state under a general named Tetricus. Simultaneously, the vital eastern territories of Syria and Egypt were seized by Zenobia, the warrior queen of Palmyra, who established her own rival throne. This map shows an empire losing its physical integrity. The simultaneous splintering of the north, west, and east meant the central administration was running out of the space and resources required to sustain itself. This was the crisis Emperor Aurelian inherited. He stepped into a political culture that historically equated imperial success with the conquest and expansion of new territory. But Aurelian looked at his overstretched legions and made a controversial calculation. The empire's borders had grown too vast for the army to defend. To save the vital core of the Roman world, he decided to break with centuries of tradition. He began to plan a deliberate contraction of the empire's borders. Aurelian's first radical maneuver targeted Dacia, a massive province north of the Danube, originally conquered by Emperor Trajan. He ordered a complete withdrawal of all Roman forces and administration from the region. This map illustrates the handoff. Aurelian officially relinquished the territory to the Goth and Vandal tribes in exchange for a peace treaty, ending decades of cross-border raiding. This eliminated a sprawling, exposed salient. By pulling back to the natural barrier of the Danube, the Romans shortened their defensive line and received 2,000 elite Gothic cavalry auxiliaries as part of the settlement. Abandoning Dacia was a calculated retreat. Aurelian prioritized a manageable, natural border on the Danube over the prestige of holding territory he could no longer defend. Just as the Danube was secured, 40,000 Alemanni horsemen crossed the Alps and began ravaging northern Italy. Aurelian marched to intercept them at the Danube. This schematic shows his initial strategy. He allowed part of the barbarian host to cross the river, then swung his legions into a crescent formation to pin them against the deep water. However, the Alemanni broke through the thinner Roman posts in the rear. They moved with such speed that they reached the territory of Milan before Aurelian's main force could catch them. Panic gripped Rome as the invaders approached the city. The Senate, fearing the army was too far away, consulted the ancient Sibylline books and performed public sacrifices in hopes of divine intervention. Aurelian eventually cornered the invaders, fighting 3 massive, bloody battles, first at Placentia, then at Fano, and finally Pavia. It took the near-total extermination of the Alemanni host to end the threat. Italy was saved, but the campaign revealed a terrifying truth. The Roman heartland, which had relied on distant frontier camps for safety, was now within reach of any barbarian host crossing the Alps. In the aftermath, Aurelian realized that even the seat of empire was no longer safe from a direct assault. He responded by constructing a 21-mile fortification of brick and concrete that entirely encircled the 7 hills of Rome. For centuries, the capital had outgrown its original walls, with suburbs sprawling into the countryside. The Romans of the past had trusted the legions on the frontier so completely that they never imagined the city itself would need to be fortified. While the wall was a magnificent piece of engineering, it was a visible sign of a new reality. The center of the empire was now permanently playing defense. Securing the core and the northern borders gave Aurelian the stable base he needed to finally move against the breakaway states. He marched west and crushed the Gallic rebellion near Chalons. The breakaway state collapsed after the usurper Tetricus, fearing his own soldiers, secretly negotiated his surrender and betrayed his troops on the battlefield. Aurelian then pivoted east to Palmyra. He defeated the armies of Queen Zenobia,
a woman who famously hunted lions and studied Greek philosophy, reclaiming her wealthy eastern territories for the empire. By sacrificing the unmanageable outer edges of the map, Aurelian found the strength to stitch the core empire back together. Aurelian inherited an empire that was failing because it had grown too large for its own resources to sustain. He saved Rome not by expanding its reach, but by pragmatically contracting its borders. By building the walls and shortening the frontiers, he gave the empire a defensible structure that would allow it to survive for 2 more centuries.
By the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire was fracturing. Decades of civil war, plague, and invasion had cracked the state into pieces. But the most immediate threat to Rome's survival wasn't coming from barbarian tribes in the north, it was rising in the east. Following the assassination of her husband, Queen Zenobia moved swiftly to fill the power vacuum of the Orient. Within 5 years, she swept through Syria and annexed the populous, fertile kingdom of Egypt, carving a massive chunk out of the Roman world for herself. Her base of operations was Palmyra. Rising like an island out of the barren Arabian desert, this oasis city controlled the lucrative trade caravans connecting the Mediterranean to Persia and India. It was wealthy, independent, and perfectly positioned to fund a massive war machine. Zenobia secured her legitimacy by blending Roman traditions with the stately pomp of Asia. She provided her sons a Latin education to pacify her Roman subjects, while simultaneously demanding the same absolute adoration that was paid to the successors of Cyrus. For herself, she reserved the diadem, ruling as the Queen of the East. Rome's answer to this rogue monarchy was Emperor Aurelian. Raised as a peasant in the Balkans, his entire existence had been forged in the military camps along the Danube frontier. He was an unlettered, battle-hardened soldier who applied the unyielding severity of the legion to every problem he faced. The Senate and the people of Rome desperately needed a leader who could stitch their broken society back together. What they sent into the desert was a human battering ram, a man who only understood how to destroy. Aurelian realized brute force wouldn't be enough. He deployed a highly effective psychological campaign, issuing sweeping pardons to cities like Antioch that surrendered without a fight. Seeing this unexpected mercy, towns across Syria quickly threw open their gates to avoid a costly siege. The decisive clash occurred near the city of Emesa. Here, Zenobia held a massive tactical advantage. Her core strike force consisted of heavy cavalry, horses and riders clad entirely in interlocking plates of solid steel. Knowing his lighter horsemen would be crushed by a direct charge, Aurelian ordered them to break and run. Zenobia's heavy cavalry took the bait, engaging in a grueling pursuit under the scorching desert sun. Once the armored horses were completely exhausted and strung out, the Romans wheeled around, easily cutting down the unwieldy unit and leaving Zenobia's infantry exposed. Her army decimated, the queen retreated behind the walls of Palmyra. Aurelian pursued her straight into the wasteland. He surrounded the city, personally pressing the attacks while his men endured constant harassment from local Arab raiders, systematically choking off her supply lines. Facing starvation, Zenobia made a final gamble. Under the cover of night, she mounted a dromedary, a desert camel capable of outrunning the fleetest horses, and bolted across the sands toward the Persian border to secure Allied reinforcements. She made it 60 miles. Right as she reached the banks of the Euphrates River, Aurelian's light cavalry overtook her. The Queen of the East was seized and dragged back to the Roman camp in shackles. Through a masterclass of battlefield patience, psychological maneuvering, and raw physical endurance, Aurelian had completely dismantled a rival superpower. Returning to the capital, Aurelian staged a victory celebration that stunned the citizens. He flooded the streets with the wealth he had ripped from the east, including the magnificent plate and wardrobe of the Syrian queen. The procession lasted from dawn until dusk. Hundreds of curious animals, royal tigers, elephants, and beasts from every climate, marched alongside 1,600 gladiators. But the crowd's eyes were fixed on the ultimate prize. Queen Zenobia was forced to walk the parade route on foot. She was bound in fetters made of gold, visibly struggling and nearly fainting under the weight of the jewels draped across her body.
Yet, once the public spectacle concluded, Aurelian behaved toward his rivals with a generous clemency. Rather than strangling them in prison, he permitted them to spend their lives in affluence. He gifted Zenobia an elegant villa at Tivoli. The former rebel queen who nearly destroyed the empire spent the rest of her life in luxury, eventually sinking into the role of a Roman matron as her daughters married into noble families. Aurelian had achieved the impossible, the complete restoration of the Roman East. He now turned his gaze back toward the administrative heart of the empire, intending to apply that same uncompromising discipline to the civil government. Having pacified the frontiers, Aurelian turned his attention to governing. He immediately set out to fix the empire's debased economy, commanding citizens to bring their adulterated coins into the treasury in exchange for newly minted currency. This policy triggered an immediate domestic crisis. The corrupt bureaucrats and mint workers who profited from the broken financial system fortified themselves on the Callian Hill, launching a serious civil war right in the center of Rome. Fast, urgently, Aurelian responded the only way he knew how. He deployed his battle-hardened legions into the city streets. The ensuing combat was a bloodbath, resulting in the deaths of 7,000 of Rome's own veteran soldiers before the mint workers were finally suppressed. The rigid brutality that made him invincible against foreign adversaries was now tearing his own capital apart. His furious demand for order was alienating the very society he had just saved. Following the uprising, he unleashed a wave of prosecutions against the Roman nobility. He governed strictly by the sword, creating an atmosphere of absolute terror among his own inner circle that proved fatal even for his own nephew. This climate of paranoia eventually trapped his personal staff. When one of Aurelian's secretaries was accused of extortion, the man realized that the emperor's threats were never in vain. Cornered, the secretary devised a desperate ploy. He forged a document in Aurelian's hand, a long and bloody list of the emperor's most trusted military officers, supposedly devoted to death. He showed it to the generals to secure his master's murder. Believing they were striking first to save their own lives, the officers ambushed Aurelian while he was on the march toward a campaign in Persia. The man who reunited the world fell by the hand of a general he had always loved and trusted. Aurelian was the perfect weapon required to violently forge a broken world back together. But a weapon cannot rule in peacetime. He could conquer the entire world, but his own success created a shadow he could not survive.